September 12, 1943. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Normandy, France. The air smelled of ripening apples and wet stone. Morning mist clung to the hedgerows that divided the Norman countryside into a patchwork of small fields, each one bordered by ancient earthen walls thick with brambles and stunted oak trees. In the distance, church bells rang the hour. 6 times. The sound carried across pastures where cows grazed, their breath visible in the cool autumn air. A boy walked along the dirt path that connected his family's farm to the village center. He was 12 years old. Small for his age, thin from 3 years of occupation rations, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed older than they should have been. His name was Étienne Moreau. He carried a canvas sack over one shoulder containing 3 eggs, a small jar of preserved cherries, and a letter his mother had written to her sister in the next village. The hedgerows rose higher than his head on both sides of the path. He knew every twist, every gap, every place where rabbits made their burrows and where wild blackberries grew thick in summer. He had walked these paths since he could remember. His father had shown him the shortcuts, the hidden gates between properties, the ways through the bocage that only locals understood. Before the war, before the Germans came, these paths had been for play, for gathering mushrooms, for visiting friends whose farms dotted the landscape. Now the paths meant something different. German soldiers patrolled the main roads. Their checkpoints divided the countryside into zones that required papers to cross. The hedgerows, the ancient maze of Norman agriculture, had become corridors of relative freedom. Relative. Never complete. But enough. Étienne reached the village square where German trucks were parked outside the commandeered town hall. Soldiers smoked cigarettes near the church steps. He walked past them without making eye contact, one small boy among the morning's movements of occupied life. At the baker's shop, he traded 1 egg for half a loaf of yesterday's bread. At the pharmacy, he collected the medicine his grandmother needed for her heart. At the edge of the square, near the old fountain, he saw Monsieur Laurent. Monsieur Laurent was the schoolteacher. Thin, bespectacled, with graying hair and hands that were always ink-stained. He stood near the fountain reading a notice board the Germans had posted. Announcements. Curfew times. Penalties for resistance activities. Rewards for information. Laurent looked up, saw Étienne, and gave the smallest nod. That evening, as darkness settled over the countryside, there was a knock at the Moreau family's kitchen door. 3 soft taps, pause, 2 more. Étienne's father opened it. Monsieur Laurent stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat. He did not remove his shoes. He did not sit down. There are men, Laurent said quietly, who need to move east. They cannot use the roads. Étienne's father said nothing for a long moment. His mother stood by the stove, her back very straight. The radio in the corner was silent. It was after curfew. No one was supposed to be outside their homes. When? Étienne's father asked. Tonight. 2 hours. How many? 4. English. Shot down 3 nights ago. They've been hiding in the Dubois barn. Étienne's father looked at his wife. She met his eyes and gave one small nod. Then his father looked at Étienne. The boy felt the weight of that look. He was 12. He knew the hedgerows better than anyone in his family except his father. He was small. He could move quietly. And if the Germans stopped him, he was just a child. The penalty would be less severe. Everyone understood this calculation, though no one spoke it aloud. Can you show them the path to Beaumont? His father asked. The question hung in the kitchen air. Outside, rain pattered against the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, British airmen were waiting in a barn, hoping for a path through enemy territory to a port where resistance networks might smuggle them across the channel. Étienne nodded. His mother turned away, her shoulders tight. His father put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Monsieur Laurent pulled a folded map from his coat pocket and spread it on the kitchen table. It showed the bocage in intricate detail, paths and hedgerows marked in pencil. Laurent's finger traced a route. Avoid Margot's farm. Germans billeted there now. The old cemetery path is safe. Beyond that, cross the stream at the stone bridge, not the wooden one. The guards smoke behind the church in Beaumont around midnight. You'll have 10 minutes. Stay in the shadows of the wall. Étienne memorized the route. He had walked most of it before, but never at night. Never with 4 foreign soldiers following him. Never with the knowledge that if they were caught, his family would pay the price. At 10 o'clock, Étienne left his house wearing dark clothes and his father's old cap pulled low. He carried nothing that would identify him if stopped. No papers, no photographs, no letters. Just one small penknife in his pocket that his grandfather had given him before the war. The night was black. Cloud cover hid the moon. Rain had turned the paths to mud. He walked carefully, placing each foot where he knew the ground would be solid. The hedgerows loomed on both sides, darker masses against the dark sky. He could smell wet earth, crushed grass, the sharp scent of nettles. The Dubois barn stood at the edge of their property, half a kilometer from the main road. Étienne approached from the north, using the cow path his friend Michel's family used during grazing season. He could see the barn's outline. No lights. No movement. He gave the signal Laurent had taught him, 3 soft whistles like a nightbird. The barn door cracked open. A figure emerged. Then another. Then 2 more. The airmen were young, younger than Étienne had imagined. One couldn't have been more than 20. They wore civilian clothes that didn't fit properly, borrowed or stolen from local wardrobes. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. 3 nights of hiding, of waiting, of wondering if they would be betrayed or discovered. None of them spoke French. Étienne spoke no English. Communication happened through gestures. He pointed at himself, then at the path ahead. He held up 4 fingers, then pointed at each of them. Stay together. Stay quiet. Follow me. They moved single file into the bocage. The hedgerows swallowed them whole. Within 30 meters of the barn, they were invisible to anyone on the roads, protected by the ancient agricultural maze that had divided Normandy's fields for 1,000 years. The airmen walked too loudly at first. Branches snapped under their boots. One stumbled in the mud. Étienne turned and pressed a finger to his lips. They understood. They learned. They became quieter. The first checkpoint was a kilometer away. German voices carried through the wet air. Laughter. The red glow of cigarettes. Étienne led the group into a deeper section of hedgerow, so thick with brambles that they had to crawl on their stomachs. Thorns caught their clothes. Mud soaked through their trousers. But they were invisible. The Germans on the road, warm and dry in their guardhouse, couldn't see 5 dark shapes moving through the earth like shadows. They emerged on the far side and continued east. The rain had stopped. The temperature dropped. Their breath misted in the cold air. Étienne could feel the tension in the men behind him. Every sound made them freeze. The distant bark of a dog. The rumble of a truck on a parallel road. The crack of a branch that might have been wind or might have been another patrol. At the old cemetery, Étienne paused. The gravestones stood in neat rows, white in the darkness. Beyond them lay the stream crossing. He could hear water rushing, swollen from recent rains. The stone bridge would be visible to anyone watching from the village. They would have to cross quickly. He gestured for the airmen to wait. Then he moved forward alone, low to the ground, until he could see the bridge. No guards. No movement. Just the sound of water and wine through the trees. He waved the others forward. They crossed in pairs, 2 at a time, running low across the stone bridge. When all 4 were across, Étienne followed. The stream rushed beneath his feet, black and cold. On the far side, they entered another network of hedgerows. These paths led to Beaumont, 3 kilometers ahead. Time moved strangely in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. Étienne's legs ached. His hands were scratched from thorns. But he didn't stop. The airman behind him breathed heavily, trying to keep pace with a 12-year-old boy who moved through this landscape like he was part of it. At 11:30, they reached the outskirts of Beaumont. The village was larger than Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. More German presence. More danger. Laurent had said the guards smoked behind the church at midnight. 10 minutes to slip through. Étienne could see the church steeple against the sky. They waited in a hedgerow, watching. At 5 minutes to midnight, 2 German soldiers emerged from a building and walked toward the back of the church. Orange flames from their lighters flickered briefly. Then darkness. Étienne moved. The airmen followed. They crossed an open street in 10 seconds, their footsteps silent on cobblestones. Into an alley. Along a wall. Behind the blacksmith's shop. Through a garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Then into the hedgerows again on the eastern side of the village. They had made it through. The safe house was 2 kilometers beyond Beaumont. A farmhouse where resistance members would take the airmen, give them new papers, new clothes, new identities. Hide them for days or weeks until the next stage of their escape could be arranged. Étienne would not go to the safe house. He would leave the airmen at the edge of the property, then return home before dawn. At 1:15 in the morning, they reached the final hedgerow. Étienne stopped and pointed through a gap in the branches. Across a dark field, a single candle burned in an upstairs window of a stone farmhouse. The signal. The airmen saw it. One of them reached out and gripped Étienne's shoulder. No words. Just the grip. Then they were gone, crossing the field toward the light. Étienne turned and began to walk home. Alone now. The return journey took less time. He knew he had perhaps 3 hours before sunrise. He moved quickly through the maze of paths, using shortcuts he hadn't risked with the airmen. Past the cemetery. Over the bridge. Around the checkpoint where Germans still smoked and laughed, unaware that 4 enemy soldiers had passed within 100 meters of them. He reached his family's farm as the sky began to lighten in the east. Gray dawn. His father waited by the kitchen door. They didn't speak. Inside, his mother poured hot water for washing. Étienne scrubbed the mud from his hands and face. Changed into clean clothes. At 6:30, he walked to the village to buy bread, the same as he did every morning. The same routine. The same face. A boy going about his daily chores in occupied France. But something had changed. Something invisible but fundamental. He had walked through enemy territory. He had guided soldiers to safety. He was 12 years old, and he had become part of the resistance. The request came again 3 weeks later. Different airmen. American this time. Shot down near Corentin. 5 men instead of 4. The same nocturnal journey through the bocage. The same careful navigation of checkpoints and patrol routes. The same silent gratitude at the moment of handover. Then again, 2 weeks after that. Then again. The pattern established itself. Roughly once every 2 to 3 weeks, Monsieur Laurent would appear at the Moreau kitchen door with information about men who needed to move through the countryside. Downed airmen. Escaped prisoners. Once, a pair of French resistance fighters fleeing from Gestapo interrogation in Corentin. They needed to reach a fishing village on the coast where boats could carry them to England. Étienne became practiced at it. The routes varied, but the principles remained constant. Move at night. Stay off roads. Use the hedgerows. Trust the maps Laurent provided. Trust the signals, the patterns of German patrols, the knowledge of which farms were safe and which were compromised. He learned to read the landscape in darkness. The way the wind moved through different types of vegetation. The smell of a farm before you could see it. The sound of boots on different surfaces, how far away that sound meant safety or danger. He learned to control his breathing, to move without sound, to sense when the men behind him were about to make a mistake and warn them with a gesture. His mother rarely spoke about it. When he returned from these nighttime journeys, she would have hot water ready and clean clothes laid out. She never asked what had happened, never asked if there had been close calls or dangerous moments. She simply prepared him to return to the appearance of normal life. His father spoke only when necessary, giving him small pieces of advice. How to judge distances at night. Which stars to use for navigation when clouds broke. Where to find water if needed. The village continued its occupied existence around this hidden activity. German soldiers patrolled. Collaborators informed. Resistance cells operated in shadow. Most people kept their heads down, tried to survive, tried to protect their families. The Moreaus appeared to be exactly this type of family. Quiet. Compliant. Unremarkable. But Étienne understood the deception now. Understood that his schoolteacher was more than a teacher. That the baker who gave him half loaves for eggs was part of a network. That the farmer whose barn served as a temporary hiding place risked execution every time he offered shelter. Understood that the war was not just fought by soldiers with guns, but by ordinary people making small, dangerous choices again and again. On Christmas Eve, 1943, he guided 6 men through the bocage in a snowstorm. The hedgerows were white, the paths treacherous with ice. One of the airmen had frostbite on his fingers. Another had been injured in the crash and could barely walk. The journey took 7 hours instead of the usual 4. They arrived at the safe house just before dawn, exhausted, frozen, but alive. Étienne walked home through snow-covered fields as the sun rose. The landscape looked peaceful, beautiful even. White pastures. Dark hedgerows. Smoke rising from village chimneys. He was 13 now. He had guided more than 40 men through enemy territory. Not one had been caught during his watches. Not one patrol had discovered them. But he knew this couldn't last forever. The Germans were not stupid. Eventually they would notice patterns. Eventually they would tighten their control. Eventually there would be a night when luck ran out, when a patrol appeared where it shouldn't, when someone talked, when the careful system of signals and safe houses collapsed. In January, 3 resistance members were arrested in Beaumont. Monsieur Laurent told Étienne's father in whispered conversation that the Gestapo had informants in several villages. Networks were being compromised. Everyone needed to be more careful. The frequency of escape operations decreased. What had been every 2 weeks became once a month, then less. Too dangerous. Too many close calls. But the requests still came. As long as Allied airmen were being shot down over France, as long as men needed to escape, the routes through the bocage remained necessary. And Étienne remained the guide. The child who knew the paths. The boy who could move invisibly through a landscape the Germans controlled but didn't truly understand. February 1944. The village changed. More German troops arrived. Younger ones, poorly trained replacements for veterans transferred to the Eastern Front. But also harder men. SS units moving through in convoys. Wehrmacht engineers building defensive positions along the coast. The occupation, which had become almost routine over 3 years, tightened into something more aggressive. New checkpoints appeared on roads that had been unwatched. Patrols increased in the countryside. German soldiers began searching barns, checking identifications more carefully, questioning movements. The space for resistance activity contracted. Étienne felt it in the air. Tension. Uncertainty. The calm, practiced deception of the past months giving way to something sharper. In the village square, German officers studied maps. Trucks arrived with construction materials. Orders were shouted. The occupiers were preparing for something. Everyone could sense it. Something large. Something inevitable. Allied invasion. No one spoke of it openly. But everyone knew. The war was going to come to Normandy. The beaches, the hedgerows, the fields where Étienne walked at night would become battlegrounds. The quiet resistance of sabotage and escape routes would be swallowed by open warfare. The night of February 22, Laurent came to the Moreau farm with urgent news. An American B-17 had gone down near Isigny. The crew had scattered. Local resistance had found 3 of them. They needed to move immediately. The Gestapo was sweeping the area. This time, Étienne's father insisted on accompanying him. The danger was too great for a boy alone. They left together at 9 in the evening, earlier than usual because the airmen had to reach the safe house before midnight. German patrols were scheduled to change at midnight, and the new patrol routes were unknown. The 3 airmen waited in a farmhouse cellar 2 kilometers west. They were injured. One had burns on his face and hands. Another had broken ribs. The third seemed unharmed physically but moved with the careful stiffness of someone in shock. They had watched their bomber explode in midair. Watched friends die. Then spent 2 days hiding in freezing barns waiting for help. Étienne led the way through familiar hedgerows. His father brought up the rear, keeping the wounded men moving. The burned airman couldn't move quickly. Every step seemed to cause him pain. The one with broken ribs breathed in short, sharp gasps. Progress was slow. Halfway to the first checkpoint, they heard voices. German. Close. Étienne froze, held up his hand. Everyone stopped. The voices were speaking rapidly, perhaps 30 meters away through the hedgerow. More than 2 men. Maybe 4 or 5. They seemed to be searching for something. Étienne's father touched his shoulder, pointed to a gap in the hedgerow. They moved silently into deeper cover, pressing themselves against the earthen wall. The wounded men followed, biting back groans of pain. The German voices grew louder. Flashlight beams cut through the branches above them. They waited. No one moved. No one breathed louder than necessary. The burned airman's face was white with pain, his jaw clenched. Étienne could smell fear, sharp and chemical. One of the Germans was less than 5 meters away, on the other side of the hedgerow. If he pushed through the branches, he would find them immediately. Time stretched. Seconds became minutes. The flashlight beams swept back and forth. More German voices joined the first group. 8 men now, maybe 10. A search party. Looking for something specific. Looking for them. The Gestapo sweep Laurent had mentioned. It had started early. Changed schedules. Changed patterns. The careful timing that usually kept them safe had been disrupted. Étienne felt his father's hand on his shoulder, steady pressure. Don't move. Don't panic. Wait. The Germans were thorough, but they were also cold, tired, ready to finish their patrol and return to warm quarters. They searched for 15 minutes, then their voices began to fade. Moving away. Continuing their sweep in another direction. The group waited 30 minutes more. Complete silence. The night air was cold enough that Étienne could feel ice forming on the branches above him. Finally, his father nodded. They could move. But the usual route was compromised. Too many patrols. They would have to take a longer path, one that added 2 kilometers and required crossing near a German garrison. Étienne had used this route only once before, in summer, in better conditions. Now they would attempt it in winter, in darkness, with wounded men. They moved through the bocage like ghosts. Every sound made them freeze. Every light in the distance meant a potential patrol. The burned airman was fading, his steps becoming unsteady. Twice he nearly collapsed. Étienne's father caught him, held him up, whispered encouragement the man couldn't understand but seemed to draw strength from anyway. At the garrison crossing, they lay flat in a frozen ditch for 20 minutes while German trucks rolled past, their headlights sweeping across the road. Étienne could feel his father's heartbeat through the ground, steady and slow. The airman's breathing was ragged, desperate. They were at the limit of endurance. When the trucks passed, they scrambled across the road and into the hedgerows on the far side. 2 kilometers to the safe house. The sky was beginning to lighten. They were running out of darkness. Étienne pushed the pace as much as he dared. His father half carried the burned airman. The others stumbled forward on willpower alone. At 5:30 in the morning, they reached the final hedgerow. The farmhouse with the candle signal. But no candle burned in the window. Something was wrong. Étienne's father saw it too. He grabbed Étienne's arm, pulled him back. They watched the farmhouse. No movement. No light. The safe house should have been ready, should have been waiting. The absence of the signal meant danger. Compromise. Germans. They couldn't go forward. But they couldn't stay in the hedgerow. Dawn was breaking. They were exposed. The airmen couldn't travel further. And returning to their home village would lead the Germans directly to the Moreau farm if they were being followed. For the first time in all these nights of guiding men through the bocage, Étienne felt true fear. Not the manageable tension of avoiding patrols, but the cold certainty that they were trapped. That the careful systems of resistance had failed. That there was no good choice left. His father made a decision. There was another farm, half a kilometer south. The Bonnet family. They weren't part of the escape network, but they had lived in the village for generations. They could be trusted. Had to be trusted. There was no other option. They moved through morning twilight. The landscape was visible now, hedgerows turning from black to grey. Birds began singing. In the distance, a rooster crowed. Normal sounds of a farm morning. But everything felt wrong, exposed, dangerous. The Bonnet farmhouse was small, its barn larger. Étienne's father knocked on the door. Once. Twice. Long minutes passed. Then the door opened a crack. Monsieur Bonnet stood there in his nightshirt, old and confused. His eyes moved from Étienne's father to Étienne to the 3 wounded airmen in Allied uniforms behind them. Understanding dawned. Fear. Then something else. Determination. Inside, Bonnet whispered. Quickly. They stumbled into the kitchen. Madame Bonnet stood by the stove, her face pale. She looked at the burned airmen and immediately began pulling out medical supplies. Étienne's father explained in rapid French, the compromised safe house, the dawn approaching, the need for temporary shelter. Bonnet nodded. The cellar. Until tonight. Then we'll find a way to move them. The airmen were taken below. The Bonnets would hide them, feed them, tend their wounds. Tonight, new arrangements would be made. New signals. New routes. The resistance network would adapt, as it always did. Étienne and his father left the farm as the sun rose fully. They walked home separately, taking different paths. When Étienne reached his house, his mother was waiting. She said nothing. Simply held him for a long moment, then sent him to wash and change. At 7:30, he walked to the village to buy bread, the same as he did every morning. March brought rain. Cold, relentless rain that turned the bocage into a maze of mud and water. The hedgerows dripped constantly. Streams overflowed their banks. The paths Étienne had walked became treacherous, slippery, difficult to navigate even in daylight. The pace of escape operations had slowed. The compromised safe house in Beaumont meant reorganizing routes. Several resistance members had been arrested. Monsieur Laurent came less frequently to the Moreau farm. When he did come, his face showed exhaustion. The network was under pressure. The Germans were becoming more systematic in their searches, more aggressive in their interrogations. But the requests still came. In early March, a British pilot. Mid-March, 2 American navigators from a bomber shot down over Cherbourg. Each time, Étienne guided them through the rain-soaked countryside, adapting routes to avoid new checkpoints, learning new patterns of patrols. He was 13.5 now. Taller, but still thin. His face showed the strain. His mother noticed dark circles under his eyes. His father noticed how he startled at sudden sounds. The accumulated tension of these nocturnal missions was leaving marks. On March 28, something happened that changed everything. Étienne was in the village, delivering eggs to the baker, when he saw German soldiers dragging a man from the church. Monsieur Laurent. His face was bloodied. His hands were bound behind his back. They threw him into the back of a truck. Other soldiers carried boxes from the church, papers, documents. They had found something. Laurent's hiding place for resistance materials. Étienne didn't run. Didn't react. Simply walked past as if nothing was happening, his heart hammering in his chest. When he reached home, he told his father. They both understood what this meant. Laurent knew the routes, knew the safe houses, knew the names of everyone involved in the escape network. If the Gestapo made him talk, everyone would be compromised. That night, there was a different knock at the door. Not Laurent's pattern. A woman's voice, speaking rapidly in French. Étienne's father opened the door. A resistance courier from Corentin. Laurent had been arrested, but before the Germans took him, he had managed to send word. 8 airmen needed to move immediately. They were in hiding locations that Laurent knew about. If he broke under interrogation, the Germans would raid those locations. The airmen had to be moved tonight, before the Gestapo could act. 8 men. Multiple locations. One night. It was impossible. Étienne had never guided more than 6 at once, and that had been with his father's help. 8 men from different hiding places would require multiple trips or an impossibly large group moving through the countryside. Either option increased the risk of discovery exponentially. But there was no choice. If they didn't move tonight, those 8 men would be captured tomorrow. And everyone who had helped hide them would be arrested too. Étienne's father made a decision. They would split into 2 groups. Étienne would guide 4 men on his usual routes to the Bonnet farm. His father would guide the other 4 on a parallel route to a different safe house. They would move simultaneously, doubling their chances but also doubling the risk. At 9 o'clock, Étienne left his house. He carried nothing but the knowledge of paths through the bocage and the weight of responsibility. 4 men were waiting in a barn 3 kilometers west. Belgian resistance fighters, not airmen. They had been passing through Normandy when Laurent's arrest forced them into hiding. He reached the barn and found them ready. They were older than the airmen he usually guided. Hardened men who had been fighting the Germans for years. They looked at this 13-year-old boy and understood immediately that their lives depended on his knowledge of these fields and hedgerows. They moved into the bocage. The rain had stopped, but everything was wet, mud thick under their boots. Étienne led them east, taking a route that avoided the main checkpoints. The Belgian fighters moved well, staying quiet, responding to his signals. They were professionals. Halfway to the Bonnet farm, disaster struck. German voices ahead. Many voices. Not a patrol, but something larger. Étienne held up his hand, everyone stopped. He crawled forward through the hedgerow, looking through the branches. Trucks. At least 4, parked on a road they needed to cross. Soldiers everywhere, setting up a temporary checkpoint. This road had been clear for months. Now it was blocked. He crawled back to the fighters. Whispered that they had to detour. One of the Belgians, older, with grey in his beard, asked in broken French how long the detour would take. Étienne calculated. 3 kilometers added to their route. At least an hour, maybe more in the mud. They would barely make it before dawn. The detour took them through terrain Étienne had rarely used. The hedgerows were thicker here, harder to navigate. They had to climb over earthen walls, push through brambles, cross a stream that was now waist-deep with rainwater. The cold was brutal. Wet clothes stuck to skin. Breath came in white clouds. 2 of the fighters began to struggle. Not from injuries, but from exhaustion. They had been hiding for days with little food and less sleep. The nighttime march through freezing mud was pushing them to their limit. At midnight, they were still 2 kilometers from the Bonnet farm. Étienne knew they were running out of time. He pushed the pace harder, but one of the fighters collapsed. Simply stopped walking and sat down in the mud. The others tried to help him up, but he shook his head. "Go on," he said in French. "Leave me." The bearded Belgian refused. "We don't leave anyone." But they couldn't stay. Dawn would expose them. Étienne made a decision. There was a small shepherd's hut half a kilometer away. He had passed it dozens of times. It was abandoned, rarely checked by patrols. They could leave the exhausted fighter there, hidden, and return for him the next night. They carried him to the hut, half walking, half dragging. Inside, it was dry but freezing. They left him with what little food they had and a blanket from the hut's interior. He would have to wait. Hope. Trust that they would come back. The remaining 3 fighters and Étienne continued. At 1:30 in the morning, they reached the Bonnet farm. The signal candle burned in the window. Bonnet opened the door, took in the 3 muddy, exhausted men, and nodded. They were safe. Étienne didn't stay. He had to return for the 4th man. Had to reach him before dawn, before German patrols found the hut. He ran back through the bocage, alone now, moving faster without wounded or exhausted men slowing him down. He reached the shepherd's hut at 3 in the morning. The fighter was where they had left him, conscious but weak. Étienne helped him up, half-carried him through the final kilometers to a different safe house, a farm closer to the hut. By the time they arrived, the sky was lightening. The farmer took the fighter without questions. Étienne walked home as the sun rose. He was covered in mud, scratched by thorns, exhausted beyond anything he had felt before. His father was already home, having successfully guided his group to their safe house. They exchanged a look. Both groups had made it. All 8 men were hidden. Laurent's arrest had not led to immediate capture. But Laurent was still in Gestapo custody. And the night's events had shown how fragile the resistance network had become. One arrest had nearly destroyed everything. One new checkpoint had almost trapped them. The margins were becoming impossibly thin. April 1944. The German military presence in Normandy increased dramatically. Convoys rolled through villages daily. Coastal defenses intensified. The bocage began to fill with observation posts, bunkers, ammunition depots. The landscape that had protected escape routes was becoming militarized. Étienne continued his nighttime missions, but everything was harder now. Routes that had been safe were watched. Safe houses that had been reliable were compromised. The resistance network was adapting, finding new paths, new contacts, but the pressure was constant. On May 3, Étienne guided what would be his last group of airmen before everything changed. 2 American pilots shot down during a raid on Cherbourg. The mission went smoothly. They reached the safe house without incident. It felt almost routine, which itself was dangerous. Complacency could kill as surely as bad luck. In late May, whispers spread through the village. Something was coming. Allied ships had been spotted off the coast. Aerial bombardment had increased. The Germans were building more defenses, faster. Everyone could feel it. The moment of invasion approaching like a storm. June 5, 1944. Étienne went to bed early. No mission scheduled that night. Outside, the wind picked up. Clouds moved across the sky. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Or perhaps not thunder. Perhaps something else. At 1 in the morning, the bombing began. The sound was like nothing Étienne had ever heard. Wave after wave of Allied bombers passing overhead, so many the air itself seemed to vibrate. Explosions erupted along the coast, bright flashes lighting up the horizon. The house shook. Windows rattled. His parents rushed to the cellar, pulling him with them. This was it. The invasion. The day they had been preparing for, hoping for, dreading for years. The bombing continued until dawn. When the sun rose on June 6, 1944, the sky was filled with aircraft. Allied paratroopers landed in fields all around the village. German troops mobilized, rushing toward the coast. The hedgerows that had sheltered escape routes became defensive positions. The paths Étienne knew so well became battlegrounds. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont sat directly behind Utah Beach. Within hours, it was surrounded by fighting. American soldiers pushed inland. German defenders held positions in the hedgerows. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Machine gun fire rattled from every direction. The Moreau family stayed in their cellar for 3 days. The battle moved around them, through their fields, past their house. They could hear tanks, explosions, screaming. Once, German soldiers sheltered in their barn. Another time, American soldiers ran past their windows. On June 9, the fighting moved east. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was behind American lines. The occupation was over. 4 years of German control had ended in 3 days of violence. Étienne emerged from the cellar into a transformed world. The village was damaged. Buildings burned. Livestock lay dead in fields. But Allied flags flew from windows. American soldiers distributed chocolate and cigarettes. People cried, hugged, celebrated. The resistance networks that had operated in shadow could now work openly. Lists were compiled of who had helped, who had collaborated. Monsieur Laurent, who had been in Gestapo custody when the invasion began, was freed by advancing Allied forces. He had not broken under interrogation. Had not given up names. The escape routes had remained secret until they became unnecessary. Étienne saw Laurent in the village square 3 days after liberation. The teacher looked older, damaged. His glasses were broken. He walked with a limp. But he was alive. He saw Étienne and gave that same small nod he had given months earlier. Recognition. Gratitude. Respect. But no one spoke of what they had done. Not yet. There were immediate concerns. Rebuilding. Caring for wounded. Finding food. The work of survival in a liberated but devastated landscape. Summer 1944. The battle moved deeper into France. Allied forces pushed toward Paris. The bocage, which had been a shelter for resistance, became a nightmare for soldiers. Every hedgerow a potential ambush. Every field a killing zone. The same terrain that had hidden escaping airmen now hid German machine gun nests. Étienne watched American soldiers struggle through the landscape he knew intimately. They didn't understand the hedgerows, the hidden paths, the ways through. Several times, he helped. Showed them gaps in walls. Pointed out concealed positions. Used the same knowledge that had guided airmen to safety to help soldiers advance. He was 13 years old, technically too young for official military service. But in those chaotic months, such distinctions mattered less. He became an informal guide, translator, liaison between Allied forces and local resistance members. In August, officers from American intelligence arrived in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. They were compiling records of resistance activities, documenting networks, identifying people who had helped Allied personnel escape. They wanted names, dates, routes. Étienne's parents were interviewed. His father provided careful, limited information. Yes, they had hidden airmen occasionally. Yes, their son had sometimes helped guide people. No, he couldn't provide specific details about others involved. The resistance had operated in cells for a reason. Each person knew only what they needed to know. The intelligence officers spoke with Étienne. Asked about the routes he had used, the number of airmen he had guided. He answered factually but without elaboration. He had guided approximately 60 men through enemy territory over 9 months. British, American, Canadian, Polish, Free French. Not one had been captured during his watches. Not one had failed to reach safety. The officers seemed impressed. They offered commendation, potential recognition. Étienne's father declined on his behalf. He's a child, his father said. He did what needed to be done. That's all. In September, Monsieur Laurent organized a quiet gathering at his house. 20 people attended. Farmers, shopkeepers, housewives. The core of the local resistance network. They shared stories for the first time. Learned details about operations they had been part of but never fully understood. Étienne heard about the full scope. The escape network had extended across all of Normandy, connected to routes through Paris, through Spain, back to England. The airmen he had guided to safe houses had continued journeys he never knew about. Some had been smuggled across the channel on fishing boats. Others had walked across the Pyrenees into Spain. A few had remained hidden in France until liberation. Laurent produced a list. Names of Allied personnel who had been moved through their sector. Étienne saw names he remembered. The burned American from February. The Belgian resistance fighters from March. Others whose faces he could still see in memory but whose names he had never known. 314 men, Laurent said, passed through our networks in Normandy between September 1943 and June 1944. 68 of them moved through routes that Étienne guided. Not one was lost. Someone asked what had happened to Laurent in Gestapo custody. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. They asked questions. I had few answers. The isolation between cells protected us. I knew about safe houses in my sector, but not others. I knew about certain couriers, but not the full network. What I didn't know, I couldn't tell them. Someone else asked if the Gestapo had used torture. Laurent's face closed. Yes, he said simply, and nothing more. The meeting ended quietly. People returned to their farms and shops. Life was slowly normalizing. Food was still scarce, but no longer rationed by occupiers. Villages could be traveled without checkpoints. Children could attend school without German propaganda. But the war continued. German forces still held much of France. The hedgerows of Normandy had been left behind, but the fighting had not ended. October 1944. Étienne enrolled in the newly reopened school. After years of disruption, education resumed. Classes were held in a damaged building, supplies were scarce, but the attempt at normalcy was important. Children needed routine, structure, something beyond war. But Étienne found it difficult. Sitting in a classroom, learning mathematics and history, seemed disconnected from the reality he had lived. The other students hadn't spent 9 months walking through darkness, guiding men through enemy territory. They had experienced occupation, certainly. Had known hunger and fear. But not the specific, focused responsibility of lives depending on your knowledge of paths through hedgerows. He struggled to concentrate. Jumped at sudden noises. Had nightmares about German patrols, about compromised safe houses, about the burned airman's face in February. His teacher, not Laurent but another survivor of the occupation, noticed. Spoke with his parents. They understood. Trauma had no age limit. In November, official recognition came that Étienne's parents had tried to prevent. The French provisional government was establishing medals for resistance service. Étienne was recommended for civilian bravery. The recommendation described his actions: 68 escape missions, 9 months of nighttime operations, 0 failures. His mother was against it. He's 14. He should be allowed to be a child. His father was conflicted. Recognition meant validation, but also attention. And attention could be dangerous even after liberation. There were still collaborators being identified, still scores being settled, still uncertainties about who had truly supported which side. In December, a letter arrived from the British government. Formal thanks for assistance rendered to Royal Air Force personnel. A similar letter came from the American military. Gratitude for aiding the escape of U.S. Army Air Force's crew members. The letters were filed away. Life continued. Winter came. The war moved further east. Allied forces pushed toward Germany. The bocage of Normandy returned to agriculture, though the fields were scarred with shell craters and abandoned equipment. Étienne continued to struggle. His parents took him to a doctor in Corentin who had experience with soldiers suffering from nervous exhaustion. The doctor recognized the symptoms. Heightened vigilance. Difficulty sleeping. Recurring fears. The mind processing trauma it had been too busy surviving to process during the events themselves. Time will help, the doctor said. And talking. Don't let him keep it all inside. But Étienne didn't want to talk. The missions had been conducted in silence. The fear had been suppressed. The knowledge that one mistake could kill people had been carried without complaint. Speaking about it now felt like exposing something that should remain protected. In February 1945, a British pilot visited the Moreau farm. He had been one of the men Étienne guided in October 1943, one of the first. He had eventually made it back to England, resumed flying, survived the war. Now he had returned to France to find the people who had saved his life. I don't remember much, the pilot said, sitting in the Moreau kitchen. It was dark. I was terrified. I followed this small boy through impossible terrain. He kept us safe. Got us to the safe house. I've wondered for a year and a half who that boy was. Now I know. He was 13 years old. The pilot looked at Étienne, who sat quietly at the table. You saved my life. Saved all our lives. I need you to know that. Whatever happened to you because of that, whatever weight you carry, you saved us. After the pilot left, Étienne's father said, he's right. You did save them. And if I had made a mistake? Étienne asked. If we had been caught. But you weren't. You made no mistakes. I was afraid every time. Every single night. His father nodded. I know. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Étienne understood intellectually. But understanding didn't ease the weight. Didn't stop the nightmares. Didn't make the classroom lessons feel relevant. He had grown up too fast, seen too much, carried responsibilities that most adults never faced. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Church bells rang across France. People danced in streets. Étienne stood in the village square watching the celebrations. He felt distant from it. The war had ended for the continent, but inside him it continued. The hedgerows at night. The German voices in darkness. The burned airman's face. The weight of knowing that lives had depended on his choices. 1946, life slowly returned to something approaching normalcy. Farms recovered. Villages rebuilt. The physical scars of occupation and liberation began to fade. But some scars remained invisible. Étienne grew. Became taller, stronger. At 15, he helped his father with farm work. At 16, he began learning a trade, carpentry, working with an uncle in Corentin. At 17, he was just another young man in post-war France, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know his history. But those who knew remembered. The resistance networks that had operated in shadow were now documented, recognized. Medals were issued. Ceremonies held. Étienne received a certificate of gratitude from the British Crown and a similar recognition from the American government. His name appeared in records of resistance activities, alongside adults who had fought the occupation in their own ways. He never sought attention for it. When people asked about the war, he gave brief answers. Yes, he had helped. Yes, it had been dangerous. No, he didn't want to talk about details. The nighttime missions remained private, personal. Something that existed in memory but didn't need to be constantly revisited. In 1950, at age 19, Étienne married a girl from the next village. They had children. Built a life. He became a carpenter, known for careful, precise work. People who hired him didn't know about the paths through the bocage, about the 68 men he had guided to safety. In the 1960s, historians began documenting resistance activities more thoroughly. Researchers arrived in Normandy, interviewing survivors, collecting testimonies. Étienne was approached multiple times. He gave brief accounts, confirmed basic facts, but resisted detailed documentation. Some experiences, he felt, couldn't be accurately captured in words. His children asked about the war when they were old enough to understand. He told them simplified versions. Yes, he had helped Allied soldiers during the occupation. Yes, it had been scary. Yes, he was proud of what the resistance had accomplished. But he didn't share the fear, the constant tension, the weight of responsibility. He wanted their childhoods to be lighter than his had been. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, major ceremonies were held in Normandy. Veterans returned. Dignitaries spoke. The escape networks were officially recognized. Étienne attended one ceremony, standing quietly among other resistance members, now middle-aged or elderly. A reporter asked him what it had been like, being a child guide for escaping airmen. He thought for a long moment, then said, "I knew the hedgerows. I knew the paths. People needed help. I gave it. That's all." The reporter pressed for more details. How had he coped with the fear? How had he managed the responsibility? Étienne looked at the hedgerows visible in the distance, still dividing the Norman fields. "You don't think about it during," he said. "You just do what needs doing. The thinking comes later." In 1994, Étienne was 63. Retired from carpentry. Grandfather to 7. The 50th anniversary of D-Day brought even larger ceremonies. He attended with reluctance, standing again among survivors, watching commemorations of events he had lived through. An elderly British man approached him. They had never met, but the man had heard Étienne's name. "Were you the child who guided my brother through the bocage in December 1943, the man asked. Étienne said he might have been. December 1943 was when he had started. The man pulled out a photograph. A young RAF pilot. He died later, the man said. Shot down over Germany in March 1944. But he wrote to me about Normandy. About a boy who saved his life. I wanted to meet you. To say thank you. To tell you that because of you, I had 4 more months with my brother. They stood together, 2 old men looking at a photograph of someone young and dead, connected by paths through hedgerows 5 decades earlier. In his final years, Étienne spoke more freely about the war. Not seeking attention, but acknowledging the weight of memory. He died in 2008, age 77. At his funeral, the list was read. 68 Allied personnel guided through enemy territory. 9 months of nighttime operations. Not one lost during his watches. The hedgerows of Normandy remain. The paths still wind through the bocage, connecting farms, dividing fields. Most people walking them now don't know they once served as escape routes. Don't know that children guided soldiers through darkness. Don't know about the quiet courage required to do what was necessary without recognition or reward. But the history is there. In records. In testimonies. In the memories of families who know their grandfather, their father, their uncle did something extraordinary when he was just 13 years old. Who know that sometimes courage comes not from soldiers on battlefields, but from children who knew the paths and chose to use that knowledge when people needed help. Étienne Moreau. One of hundreds of French civilians who resisted occupation in their own ways. One of dozens of guides who led men through enemy territory. One of very few who did it as a child. His story is not unique, but it is particular. Specific. Real. The war asked impossible things of ordinary people. Some refused. Some complied. Some resisted. Étienne, at 12 years old, made a choice. Then made it again. And again. 68 times, he walked through darkness, guiding men who trusted their lives to a child who knew the hedgerows. That trust was not misplaced. That courage, quiet and without drama, saved lives. And now, decades after the last mission through the bocage, after the occupation ended and the resistance networks dissolved, the memory remains. Not as grand narrative or heroic legend, but as simple fact. A child who knew the paths. Soldiers who needed to reach safety. A war that required courage from unexpected sources. And a boy who, when asked if he could help, said yes.